Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Adam S. Lovinger, the Vice President at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, who joins us today to discuss his new book, The Insider Threat: How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. Adam will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Adam S. Lovinger.
Thank you for the opportunity. I've been asked to talk about the weaponization of the security clearance process in specifically the U.S. Department of Defense and my experience. What I'll do is I'll begin by really talking about my experience, telling a story, and then to try to contextualize what happened to me within sort of the broader systemic problem of not only weaponization of security clearances, but also the sort of the corruption that breeds within our national security bureaucracy. So I had been working in the highest level strategy office of the Pentagon for a dozen years, and as soon as Donald Trump won the presidency in November of 2016, General Mike Flynn, the National Security Advisor designee, asked for me to come over to the National Security Council as his Senior Director for Strategic Assessments. Around that time, actually shortly before that happened, there was a leak of classified information that took place in the very office that I was working in. It's called the Office of Net Assessment. It's the highest level strategy office in the Pentagon. Now, how did my accusers weaponize the security clearance process? When there was a leak of classified information, and this was actually an ally's classified information, this was the Japanese government's classified information, there was supposed to be a criminal investigation conducted by the U.S. Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. The leadership of the Office of Net Assessment, as well as some other senior bureaucrats inside the Pentagon, decided they were not going to report this leak to the Office of Inspector General. They were going to investigate it themselves. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that they were incriminated by that leak because they had not ensured that the various parties who were handling this classified information had the required security clearances and that the proper procedures were in place. So what they did is they took over this investigative process illegally, and then they investigated me. And they did that while I was transitioning from the Pentagon to the NSC. So when I got to the NSC, I found myself under investigation. And this was the first time in the 12 years I'd been in the Pentagon I'd ever been under investigation for anything. And curiously, what happened is that this investigation incriminated my accusers. And instead of arresting that problem and turning it over to the Inspector General's office, which that investigation recommended be done, they sort of canceled that first investigation and did a do-over investigation. And this time, they ensured that a direct subordinate of theirs did the investigation of me. And the internal documents that I received in the course of a multi-year process that I lay out in my book here, The Insider Threat, that Encounter Books published last month. The multi-year process that I had to go through to fight to regain my security clearance, which I still have not regained, lays out how the process, even after they did this do-over investigation. They, instead of focusing on finding the source of the leak, they focused purely just on investigating me. That this process was really hermetically sealed off from all oversight. When you have an office that's responsible for a leak and they're self-investigating, this really should not happen in America. This is more of like a Soviet practice. And I would say that the bigger issue here is the checks and balances are not working. This brings me really to a larger point that I lay out in the book, is that there is what I call an insider threat within the national security bureaucracy. And that threat is various hyper-empowered senior officials who are collaborating from particular nodes within the US national security bureaucracy. And these are typically offices that have very, rather boring functions, like various personnel offices, security clearance offices, adjudication offices, particular, personnel positions within the Office of General Counsel, the offices of Inspector General, the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. These offices do not have, sexy or particularly interesting writs, but if you have corrupt officials controlling certain key nodes within the national security bureaucracy, there's a lot of room for weaponization. And these particular offices that are taken over by these corrupt officials to generally weaponize government against their political and ideological adversaries. Once you have the active collaboration through these multiple offices, you can do a tremendous amount of damage to one's political or bureaucratic or ideological adversaries within the national security bureaucracy. So this is what I discovered. I'm a lawyer by training. I was trained to appreciate and to revere America's constitutional order, where there are, at least as laid out in theory, there are checks and balances, and there are no self-investigations that would be permitted. But one of the most troubling revelations, and I do lay this out in my book, is that when you have this sort of weaponization of the investigative process, when you can remove someone's security clearance, based upon lies, and really even scapegoat them for one's own misconduct, when you have this capacity to silence whistleblowers with impunity, this generates an internal rot within our national security bureaucracy. And not only is that internal rot troubling by itself, because it prevents America from, fighting and successfully winning our wars, for example, like we failed to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as many other pathologies. But also it invites, as I lay out in my book, America's enemies to insinuate themselves into our national security bureaucracy. And what I mean by that is that when you have this corruption, when you have a culture of corruption, and you have dirty dealing, you have ideologues who have captured these nodes that I talked about within the national security bureaucracy. This is like catnip for the Russians, for the Chinese, for the Iranians. Why is that? Why is that so enticing? Well, America's enemies have learned long ago that taking America on head on, for example, like the Japanese and the Germans did in the Second World War, can be a rather crushing experience. And even the Soviet experience, where there was a Cold War that was really, but it still was a battle of the superpowers. Unless you have a tremendous economy and the sort of the power that can come up, that can take on a country like the United States, it's best not to do that. So what I mean by all this is that America's enemies have learned long ago that you don't take America head on. It's much better to insinuate yourself into America's national security bureaucracy. Washington as a whole, America's universities, for example, you see a lot of the protests going on at American university campuses. This is funded by the Chinese. It's funded by the Qataris. And so this indirect approach is the favored approach of our adversaries, and it also happens to be a comparative advantage of theirs. The Russians, have over 100 years of subversive experience, trying to undermine America from within. The Chinese are very good about this as well. The Iranians have this, this sort of a culture of the shuk, of operating indirectly. Our adversaries, this is their comparative advantage. America, as an open democratic country, we're very bad at keeping adversaries at bay this way. We tend to be very open, but that includes our national security bureaucracy. So all this is to say that this corruption that I encountered, and the weaponization of the security clearance process, this is part of a bigger problem, a bigger rot inside the U.S. national security bureaucracy that has become increasingly apparent. There's other authors that have had encounter books publish their work recently. One is Mark Moyer, who wrote a fabulous book called Masters of Corruption. Another is Ned Ryan, who wrote a book called The American Leviathan. These are excellent books that really, shed light on the pathologies of the administrative state, the corruption that can be engendered in the administrative state if there are not adequate checks and balances. The Gold Institute, that I'm a very proud member of, along with Ellie Gold at the, we have an administrative state accountability project. We've been studying the problems and the pathologies and the conflicts of interest that have really taken over the national security bureaucracy in this country for several years now, and have come to some conclusions as to what could be practical solutions to this systemic problem. It's a problem that shouldn't exist in America. Our founders actually warned about this in the Federalist Papers, about how a corrupt, unaccountable bureaucracy would be attractive to America's enemies. And this is something that we have failed to heed this lesson. And not only was it something that emerged out of the Federalist Papers and was discussions in the early years of the Republic, but we also have extensive evidence of Soviet infiltration of the United States during the Cold War. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Western intelligence got access to tremendous volumes of KGB archives and Soviet intelligence service archives. And we learned genuinely that there was almost no major American institution that had not been infiltrated and subverted from within. And so this is something that not only is a problem that affects and undermines the U.S. government's capacity to deliver good governance to the American people, but it does, as I lay out in my book, pose a genuine insider threat to our republic. And with that, I will turn it back over to my host. I'm very grateful to the Middle East Forum and take any questions and anyone may have.
All right. Well, thank you. That all sounds fascinating. I hope to pick up your book here soon and get more in the dirt with all this. But to bring it back to kind of the mission here at the Middle East Forum, I'd like to ask, how do these instances of weaponization within the national security bureaucracy affect the current conflicts taking place in the Middle East?
Yeah. So as I lay out in the book, one of the problems when you have an unaccountable and even sort of, weaponized federal bureaucracy, the weaponization of security clearances, is that you can implant ideological operatives, for lack of a better word, in key positions in the national security bureaucracy. I'll give you an example. So Andrew W. Marshall was my first boss at the Office of Net Assessment. He had been appointed by James Schlesinger in 1973, a brilliant strategist and mentor of mine and that of many others. Mr. Marshall was removed rather ruthlessly in the year 2015 by the Obama administration. And, why is that? He was removed because the very purpose of this office, the Office of Net Assessment, this high-level strategy office, is to ensure American primacy, long-term American preeminence. And that's not because we wish to subjugate the world, but just because we want to uphold classical liberal global order, rule of law, genuinely free commerce, human rights, all the sort of the American values that we hope we aspire to here at home, and we want to create a conducive environment for that internationally. This traditional vision of the Office of Net Assessment was anathema to the Obama doctrine. Obama did not believe in a preeminent America. He did not believe in American primacy. He characterized it as imperialist, as hegemonic, as oppressive to non-Western countries. And there was this genuine effort within the Obama administration to erode America's primacy. And you don't need to take my word for it. I lay out the evidence in the book. There is a lot of evidence of that, but this greatly impacts America's capacity to fight and win our wars. During the Obama administration, during those 8 years, there were no strategies. There were no net assessments that would inform national security strategies to win our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because winning was not part of the agenda. You see the woke ideologues on American university campuses. This is not taking place in a vacuum. The Obama administration is very much cut from that same cloth, that America needs to be cut down some notches. And so when you have this, what I call the deep state, operating in high-level positions within the national security bureaucracy, you will have this sort of subversion. And you will even, get the Iran deal, for example, where, you are genuinely empowering one of America's greatest adversaries to balance the Israelis, one of America's greatest allies. I mean, this was the reason for the Iran deal. It's increasingly not a secret, but I saw this at the Pentagon. This was a strategic objective to balance Israel, and so it has tremendous impact. This subversion does result in policy and strategic outcomes.
All right, thank you. Now, that's a good segue into this next question here. It comes from former U.S. senatorial candidate Denise Gary Pandal, who asks, are you familiar with the whistleblower Philip Haney, who exposed the corruption in the DHS during the Obama-Biden administration? And can you maybe comment on that?
Yeah, so I knew Philip Haney, and Philip Haney was a whistleblower, I believe a very courageous whistleblower, and I had met with him on several occasions. He was found dead on the side of a road. I believe it was in California. I do not know precisely the circumstances of his death. It was rather suspicious, but what I can tell you is that in chapter 23 of my book, I report for the first time a murder that has been covered up as a suicide to date. And I don't say this lightly. I ran this to ground. I got the evidence from the horse's mouth. In a nutshell, I'll tell you, it was the murder of a senior DOD Office of Inspector General investigator. And he was investigating senior leader misconduct. He was found dead in the trunk of his car on a DOD facility. There was an investigation by local law enforcement. They determined that it was a homicide. That investigation was covered up They did a do-over investigation. You'll see a pattern here. They did a do-over investigation of me when they didn't get the results they wanted the first time. But in this case, they did a do-over investigation, and they narrowed the scope of investigation only to suicide. And sure enough, they got suicide the second time around. And before reporting this in my book, I worked very carefully with my publisher to go back to the Alexandria Police Department, which is the entity that did this criminal investigation, to authenticate this Freedom of Information Act file. And they authenticated it. They said, yeah, this determination that it was a homicide is precisely what we came up with. But for some reason, to this day, it has been covered up and reported publicly as a suicide. So, you mentioned Philip Haney. I understand he left a suicide note. So his case may not be this case, but the deep state does murder people, I've learned. Not only the evidence that I've uncovered myself working with some internal whistleblowers, but I was on General Flynn's Patriot TV the other day, and we had a small back and forth with his knowledge of other murders that take place and get covered up. And so, this is not a as David Ignatius calls the deep state, Trump's crazy talk. No, this is a genuine insider threat that collaborates with America's enemies, with the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, and murders U.S. officials who don't go along with their corruption.
All right, now thank you. And now that is a good segue here to a question we have from David Levine, who asks, do you have any specific suggestions on how the Trump administration or the incoming Congress can begin to tackle the entrenched power of the deep state?
Yeah, I've actually thought about this quite a bit. And work we've done at the Gold Institute on our Administrative State Accountability Project with my colleague and friend Ellie Gold has also focused on this. When I went to law school, I developed a love for America's constitutional order. There's tremendous brilliance in the Enlightenment thinking that went into creating checks and balances within our federal government. And one of the perverse evolutions that we have seen take place, and this is the entity that's responsible for the murder I was just talking about, is the growth of inspectors general. These offices of inspectors general are checking and balancing the very entities that pay their salaries and provide for their pensions. It is a horrible, perverse conflict of interest that the founders of this country, the drafters of the Federalist Papers, if they could see what we're doing today, would be turning over in their graves. It is a joke. Inspectors General, the United States Office of Special Counsel, these are entities that are supposed to check and balance the executive branch, but they are creatures of the executive branch. They cannot do that. These entities must be dismantled, and that function of checking and balancing, of conducting oversight of the executive branch must be transferred to Congress. There should be large congressional oversight entities overseeing this corruption inside the executive branch. It's so bad that I can tell you from firsthand experience working with Congress, and I won't name names, but Congress actually, some of the oversight committees in Congress who are trying to conduct oversight of various entities, various agencies, rely upon the inspectors general and those very agencies to do the investigative work. So it's pretend oversight. It's not real congressional oversight. And the American people are really getting the short end of the stick because this corruption gets perpetuated by the inspector general system as it exists now. I'm very pleased that President-elect Trump has issued a 10-point plan for dismantling the deep state and returning power to the American people. And I believe that's the actual name of it. And one of those is to focus on inspector general independence and objectivity. I would even take it further and encourage just dismantling the Inspector General system and transferring it to Congress.
Now, do you anticipate that President Trump will get a lot of pushback for this proposal?
I do anticipate it. I would encourage President Trump to use my book as Exhibit A. If inspectors general are murdering their own senior investigators because they're not towing the line, this is a very good argument to use. This retired colonel in the U.S. Air Force, Stephen P. Luke, who was murdered, according to the Alexandria Police Department, a senior investigator, his death should not be in vain. This is, if there's any ringing endorsement for dismantling this corrupt inspector general system, it is this. And I can't imagine that any fair-minded American could stand up and argue to the contrary of that.
Yeah, of course. Now, another question here from Mr. Levine. Do you have any fears that by discussing the treacherous behavior of the deep state personnel, you are, in fact, putting yourself in danger of being harmed or killed?
I have no question about it. Of course I am. I've talked about this with my family, with my wife, and this is a genuine concern. But I owe it to my country. I owe it to my students at Georgetown University. I owe it to my children to uncover this cancer, this rot. America's been very good to me and my family, and it's these gangsters who undermine America from within. And the incoming FBI director, Kash Patel, wrote a book called Government Gangsters. And so, it's not just me who sees this. Those of us who've been inside the belly of the beast have seen this thing up close and personal. And yes, it does murder people, and I could very well be targeted. I'm taking the precautions I can take. I've alerted various authorities to concerns that I have and threats and what have you. But this has to be fought. This has to be fought.
Well, you are doing a brave and valiant service to the country. We hope and pray that it doesn't come to that point. I think we have time for maybe one more question here. Jay Lewis asks, was the source of this leak ever uncovered, and what happened to that person or persons?
So I believe the leak you're referring to is the leak of classified information that was weaponized, not to investigate the source of the leak, but just to target me by my accusers in the Office of Net Assessment. No, the source of the leak was never properly investigated, and it was a real betrayal of a foreign government whose classified information was mishandled. And that foreign government is the government of Japan. Japan's classified information was leaked, and instead of ensuring that the DoD Office of Inspector General investigated that leak of classified foreign government information, which is a very important thing, according to Japanese intelligence, and again, I have this in my book, that leak threatened Japanese warships in the Western Pacific Ocean. But the deep state would prefer to scapegoat me, because General Flynn wants me to come over to the Trump White House, than actually get to the bottom of this leak, which the Pentagon promised the government of Japan that they would leak, that they would investigate. But that was never done. And according to my sources, to this day, there's been no attempt to investigate that leak, which threatened Allied warships in the Western Pacific Ocean.
All right. Well, thank you. We have unfortunately run out of time and reached the end of this week's podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to give us your insights and tell us about your new book.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and for our audience, once again, that book is called The Insider Threat: How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. And before we sign off here, is there anywhere where our viewers and listeners can go if they'd like to follow more of your work?
Yes, well, you can go to the Gold Institute website, which is where I hang my hat. It's where I work, and the book's available on Amazon, and I'm available on LinkedIn. So if anybody wants to continue the discussion, I'm very happy to engage with them that way.
All right, very good. And if you are watching this in the future, I will be sure to put a link to the Gold Institute in the video description below. And as always, to our viewers and listeners, I want to thank you all again for your viewership and your participation. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope you all enjoy the holidays. Thanks.